locus amoenus. The arcades are, like in the San Apollinare Nuovo church, the representative structure and perhaps a pars pro toto of palace architecture. This is already in late antiquity as a structural form, slightly variated always. But the main thing, even with an inscription denominating it as a palace, shows the architecture with curtains as a signum, as the imperial palace, and situated in the church under a sort of arcades with holy figures of the prophets and the patriarchs in this church. Already in late antiquity, these forms tended to be used and variated, like in this famous sarcophagus from Old St. Peter with the dispersion of the law, represented by Christ giving the law in a roll, and the attendants being shown in front of a great architectural background. Variations show the arcades in form of trees, like in this sarcophagus from Arles, with several scenes from Old and New Testament here, with Susanna and the elders apparently right of the central motive, and in another famous casket in the British Museum from the treasure of the Equilinus, where even the change of arcades with pointed structures is used in order to variate the enclosed forms. More famous has become a rather recent find of a curtain. This is monumental, 2 meters high and I don't know how many meters long, in the Abeck Foundation, reconstructed from bad fragments and showing Bacchus, a late antique representation in the central arch with, it's the naked figure here, sorry, with other representations leading towards the central figure. These arcades, as I want to emphasize, seem also to concentrate on certain parts of larger exposure, in the larger feature, architectural feature, or the representation, for example, in only diptychal form in 2 niches represented on ivories, like here on apparently part of a diptychon with the Archangel Michael. You can imagine what I want to somehow introduce to you, and this is the notion, of course, of the Mashhad facade, which will appear in short again. For the many examples of this early Islamic palace architecture in the region, it has always been formulated in the earlier art history that the main ideas were somehow taken from Byzantine or late antique models, and that the ornamental additions appeared as a rather crude or unpretentious stylization of antique motifs. Even in this afternoon, I sometimes heard the formulation, like by Gabriele Mietke, that the representations within the frames are rather haphazard. The frames she mentioned were the frames by a vine scroll, for example, with several depictions of ordinary life scenes, agricultural scenes, hunt, and other scenes. Do we know what and why they were represented? I wonder. I would tend to the idea that we will have to wait for certain time until inspiration comes to art history, how to look at it perhaps again. This wonderful wooden representation has only one arcade in the center, and that should somehow lead to the idea that the sides are leading your eyes or the beholder towards this center. And of course we have to dwell a minute on the famous find of the Islamic Geniza from Sana'a, the treasure of several 10,000s of Quran fragments in the old mosque of Sana'a 40 years ago, among which was found this extraordinary frontispiece of a Quran of apparently the Umayyad period, showing niches like the galleries of a mosque around perhaps what is a courtyard, with perhaps what looks like some sort of minaret, which didn't exist at that period as far as we know, and a doorway. So the niches are being filled with flowers and some other vegetal motifs only. Now, for architecture in the Umayyad period, famous is the main hall or the introductory hall to the Umayyad palace in Amman Citadel, which has recently become a wooden dome, maybe with a good reason, maybe not, but showing arcades in small form and in the larger form, with an arcade cutting out a vegetal ornament from a virtual repetition into this one tree for each large arcade. And now I think you are prepared to look at the Mashhad facade, somehow slightly manipulated by my presentation, which might help us in seeing this as an intentional architecture. First, some dates, of course. The facade is 47 meters long. It is set into the facade between two half towers, two of the half towers encircling the whole architecture, namely here. And it used to be there until 1903, when the famous friendship between Turks and Germans brought about that a little present was given by Sultan Abdul Hamid to his friend Wilhelm in shape of the Mashhad facade. And the German archaeologists and historians who were interested in it looked at especially the left part of the facade and detected the right part. This looks all the same, so they took only half of it. The rest of that right facade, unfortunately, got lost. And still, what arrived in Berlin in 1903 in 449 blocks was immediately studied by several art historians, and it took 10 years to define that this should be labeled as Islamic and put into the early Umayyad period, into the Umayyad period at the end of the Umayyad period. Many famous names, Ernst Herzfeld and Karl Heinrich Becker, the later cultural minister of Prussia, were involved. Then came the interpretations of Richard Hamilton on the probable patron of Mashhad, who was found out that most probably the second Caliph Al-Walid ibn Yazid, should be the patron of this extraordinary building, because he was famous as a poet, and Richard Hamilton, in his fine study on Al-Walid and his friends, you can imagine this is not work on politics, but more on bacchanal stories we have heard about already today. The allusions to Christian girls in his poetry. But perhaps these were misunderstood as an erotic predilection. I would rather see a sort of provocation when Al-Walid names on last Sunday, I saw a girl kissing a piece of wood. Oh, would I have been at the place of the wood? Can you imagine a Muslim caliph who wants to be in the form of Corpus Christi? That is, of course, a provocation and not a sort of just witty idea. The continuities of development of trends from late antiquity were already formulated in the early 20s by Karl Heinrich Becker and in the 10s of 1910 to 1918. And so the great architectural historians Creswell followed the ideas. He brought a funny list in his early Muslim architecture volume of the many interpretations under his period. Only Oleg Grabar in 1987 was the first to doubt the Umayyad period, and in a similar provocative way, which was very typical for him, I think he formulated, why isn't it Abbasid, some 50 years later? And this now brings us to the program, which is in the project, which is at the moment under work by Johannes Kramer of the Technical University in Berlin and Barbara Perlich. In the excavations on the spot, they have found in the courtyard an Abbasid coin under a floor, an early Abbasid coin of, I think, 770s. And what does that mean? We are at present at a row. We are still at speaking terms. I would say this is impossible, but we must keep the field open for possible Abbasid usage of the site. Dorothee Sack has dwelt on the plan and has defined that such a sumptuous architecture with a tricunc, most probably vaulted and domed room, a large basilica hall leading to it, and the many vaulted rooms around it. This is a residential type of architecture, and we cannot but think that this is, sorry for the bad pictures, I think I should have looked better into that. This is a residential architecture. It's not a palace like those of other palaces, smaller palaces in the Syrian and Palestinian and Jordanian region. At the other end of the courtyard is another facade, which already in drawings at the beginning of the 20th century were reconstructed with arches here and medallions like in the facade. And by chance, Barbara Perlich found the design of arches engraved at the facade. This has been published recently, so I don't want to dwell on it. It's not our subject, but it's one of these very exciting examples of building designs at a building, and they showed that the arch should be nearly pointed. This is what has been reconstructed by the team of Berlin Technical University with mainly original stones and showing the point here. Therefore, they did reconstruct it like a Gothic arch.